In this first video, I'll talk about one of my favorite topics, Hungary between the two world wars. True, I'm somewhat obsessed with the subject, but at the same time, one can hear so much nonsense about this period that a detailed explanation is needed. In a relatively short period, only 25 years, the country saw military defeat, two revolutions, political chaos, economic collapse, followed by the return of the monarchy, gradual recovery and consolidation, political and diplomatic realignment, secret rearmament, and a reluctant entry into the new war. It is certainly worth looking into, partly because people tend to label interwar Hungary a fascist dictatorship, while others claim it was actually closer to a constitutional monarchy, or even a parliamentary democracy. Whenever views are so divided, something is going on. Let's see what it is. Hungary between the two world wars was personified by its head of state, Admiral Miklós Horthy, last commander of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. However, from naval officer to become regent, he had to be very patient and careful, then pick up the pieces after the two failed revolutions, foreign military occupation, and diplomatic maneuvering by the Entente powers and their allies in the region. In October 1918, the Great War was finally drawing to a close. The military situation was hopeless, Germany was on its knees, and Austria-Hungary was collapsing. People were fed up with the war and the suffering it had brought. The various ethnic minorities were now ready to break away. Emperor Karl was powerless to stop this, while Hungary's political elite had growing fears about the country's internal situation and the ever greater appetite of its old and new neighbors. On the last day of the month, the so-called Asper Revolution succeeded. Former Prime Minister István Tisza, who back in 1914 had been against the war, was murdered by returning soldiers, and Count Mihály Károly was named Prime Minister of the new People's Republic of Hungary. The new republic faced enormous difficulties. The war was lost, the economy was in shambles, and all the neighboring countries were trying to grab as much land as they could. Demobilization, together with a rather naive and unsuccessful foreign policy, which relied on the goodwill of Hungary's former enemies, meant that the republic was doomed from the start. The loss of entire regions and internal chaos would soon leave only one option on the table: the formation of a far-left dictatorship and decisive military action against the invaders. In March 1919, to the horror of the Entente, the Hungarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed. Count Károly left the country. He was replaced by Béla Kun, leader of the Communists. Red Terror was introduced to deal with all internal opposition, followed by a mobilization to stop and throw back the advancing Czech and Romanian forces. In May, the northern campaign was successful. Almost half of Upper Hungary was retaken, then abandoned once again, as Béla Kun accepted the new demands of the Entente powers. This demoralized the troops, so the next offensive against the much larger Romanian army quickly turned into a rout. Budapest was occupied in early August, and the second revolution failed. Its leaders fled to Vienna. In the next 6 months, 3 different governments tried and failed to stabilize the situation, which also meant that the peace treaty could not be signed. During this time, Admiral Horthy was gaining more and more support, thanks partly to Entente delegates, who, as fellow naval officers, acknowledged his leadership qualities and straightforward, honest demeanor. He was a nationalist, a staunch anti-communist, a military leader with actual results, out of which a legend was being created, so he seemed to be the ideal candidate to stabilize the country and bring it to the post-war era. Hungary was once again a kingdom, a constitutional monarchy with no king, because finding the right person was more problematic than ever before. Even though some people wanted the return of the House of Habsburg, and Karl even tried twice, unsuccessfully, mainly because neither the Entente nor Horthy wanted to return to the pre-war system. Apparently, the Habsburgs had outlived their usefulness as the great stabilizing force in Central Europe. At the same time, many realized that delaying succession to the throne could be a good move, as this would not dash the hopes of any one faction. In the meantime, Horthy became regent and started building his own power base, first to consolidate the new system, then prepare for a possible future, one in which his own son could succeed him. The question is, was he building a dictatorship? On June 4, 1920, the Treaty of Trianon was finally signed, creating the small country we know today as Hungary. It meant that 3/4 of the territory and 2/3 of the population were lost to neighboring countries, but the treaty also included severe restrictions on Hungary's armed forces, armaments industry, and other parts of the economy to prevent a future resurgence. Naturally, for the new government, the primary objective was the eventual recovery of the lost territories, but this had to wait. First, the White Terror had to be stopped, then the country would have to return to some sense of normalcy. As I mentioned before, this old new Hungary was officially a constitutional monarchy, without an actual monarch. Admiral Horthy was appointed regent. He became head of state with strong powers that somewhat resemble presidential authority in countries like the United States, except that his term was indefinite. Appointing a regent was a smart move, because it is supposed to be a temporary solution, so those power groups that desired the eventual election of a new king could now back Horthy until a proper candidate was found. The regent had almost all powers of a king, with certain limitations. He could delay bills and parliamentary procedure. He could veto bills, a certain number in a given period, but, at least until 1937, Parliament could move against him in case he violated the constitution. Unlike a king, he could not grant noble titles. He could only declare war or make peace with the approval of Parliament, which was also required in case he wanted to utilize the army outside the country. He could also not grant immunity to members of his cabinet, although he himself had the same protection granted to a king, which meant immunity except in the gravest violations of the law. He had to rely on the various ministries in order to utilize his executive powers, but he could represent the country and sign international agreements. From 1926, certain restrictions on his power were reduced. Then, during the 1930s, some of them were removed. As a result, he could delay bills for up to 1 year and even dissolve parliament with total immunity and the option of naming a successor, which turned out to be his own son in 1942. The elections in 1920 were supposedly open and free, but also chaotic due to military occupation and unstable borders. The Social Democrats refused to participate. Several districts reported unanimous results, so the conservative right-wing parties won in a landslide. This was followed by the 1922 elections, with more restrictions on the electorate, because only men over the age of 24 with grade 4 education and women over the age of 30 with grade 6 education could participate, and in most districts outside Budapest, your vote was not secret. This way, the newly formed Unity Party gained and then maintained a comfortable majority in parliament, while the Social Democrats hovered around 5%, with the Liberals winning only 3% of the available seats. This system prevented major changes, but under the surface, there were significant social and political movements due to a changing global climate, the successes of fascist Italy and then Nazi Germany, and the gradual shift to the far right by the fascist faction within the Unity Party, which was later renamed National Unity Party and then Party of Hungarian Life. Economic recovery was of primary importance. Under Prime Minister Count Bethlen, Hungary joined the League of Nations in 1922, which led to the approval of a significant loan. Using this money, the government provided loans to boost the development of infrastructure, agriculture, tourism, the transportation sector, and electrification. A new currency, the penge, was introduced in 1927, and the economy as a whole more or less recovered by that time. A program of cultural supremacy was launched. Hundreds of new schools were built in small towns and villages. Literacy rates increased and reached almost 100%. Then came the Great Depression, which meant that yet another decade was lost as the country tried to recover. Looking at the political system, the decisions made by the various prime ministers, we get the feeling that Horthy and his supporters were trying to maintain an equilibrium in a changing world. In their eyes, only a stable conservative government could unite the nation and restore its glory. Any compromise with the far left was out of the question. The Communist Party was banned, its leaders were imprisoned or in exile, but cooperation with the Social Democrats was ensured through a deal. This way, the Hungarian parliament had an actual opposition. These opposition parties had their own newspapers, so we cannot say that this was an outright dictatorship. The various far-right movements and factions posed a significant problem from the start. To appeal to existing sentiments, and also to ensure more positions for middle-class refugees arriving from occupied regions, a so-called numerus clausus was implemented back in 1920. Its aim was to limit the ratio of Jews in higher education to 6%, which was their proportion in Hungary at that time. The ratio of Jewish students fluctuated over time. Then in 1928, due to international pressure, the ethnicity quota was eliminated, but the situation worsened again from 1938 as German pressure increased. Placating the far right was becoming more and more dangerous. Stabilizing the economy was one thing, preventing social changes and the strengthening of radical movements was almost impossible, especially after 1930-31. The conservative elite was bending over backwards, trying to preserve their own rule, but a growing number of political and military leaders were trying to find new solutions based on the German example. A new energetic prime minister, Yula Gambesh, was pursuing closer ties with Germany and Italy in the mid-1930s, while advocating a national work program until he died in 1936. By that time, he managed to alienate not only the Social Democrats and the Party of Small Landowners, but also Horthy himself, who regarded him as too radical. However, German power and influence could not be disregarded. By 1938, there was no alternative. After the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany, Hungary had to move even closer to Germany, hoping for a peaceful solution to its disputes with neighboring countries. Initially, this was successful, as Germany and Italy forced Czechoslovakia and then Romania to negotiate and allow some territories to return. Hungary effectively doubled its size and its population within 3 years, reuniting most Hungarians in the Carpathian Basin, but it also gained significant ethnic minorities. In return, the country would export more agricultural products and also divert part of its small arms production capacity to Germany. The first so-called Jewish law was accepted in 1938. It aimed to push out Jews from certain professions like law and journalism, but also commerce and industry. This was followed by the second and then the third version in 1939 and 1941, with more restrictions and a wider interpretation of Jews as a religious and ethnic group. These laws had serious financial repercussions, but posed no direct threat to the life of Jewish citizens. A military labor service was introduced with more dire consequences, in some cases involving physical violence, especially from 1942. Still, apart from a handful of isolated incidents, Jews in Hungary were relatively safe until March 1944, the German occupation. 1939 was to be the last year elections were held, due to the breakout of World War II. By that time, German influence was so strong that the leader of the most significant Hungarian Nazi party, Ferenc Szálasi, had to be released from prison. What's more, some historians speculate that had there been free and open elections, his Arrow Cross party would have won easily. This was because Germany and Italy were the only major powers who supported Hungarian irredentism, the gradual recovery of their previously lost territories. The people of Hungary felt that only Germany was both willing and able to help the country, although they themselves did not desire war. At the same time, Horthy kept trying to find a prime minister that was just the right person to balance growing German pressure with Western contacts in case a war broke out in Europe, and later during the war to ensure that Hungary would not be fully committed to the Axis cause. In 1938, he rejected Hitler's idea that Hungary should attack Czechoslovakia, but he leapt into action when the northern neighbor was dissolved in March 1939. Romania was a tough nut to crack. Hungary could not initiate military action with the hope of success, so once again German and Italian pressure was needed to settle the matter. When it came to Yugoslavia, Horthy hesitated, but after the suicide of Prime Minister Teleki, who was pro-British, he decided to participate in the Axis attack. The possibility of regaining more territories was just too enticing. In early 1942, with the war raging on various fronts, the Regent tried another balancing act with the appointment of Prime Minister Kálay. Kálay was pro-Allies. He initiated secret negotiations with the British and American delegates in Turkey, but the Allies indicated that they would not sign a separate peace treaty without the Soviets. This was something the Hungarians wanted to avoid at all cost. Having occupying forces in Soviet Russia made things difficult, but in the end, the Allies promised not to bomb Hungary as long as the country stayed away from the actual fighting, a promise which they kept until mid-1944, although Hungary did send more occupying forces to Russia. It should be noted that Horthy's own son and named successor, István, was pro-American, having spent some time in the US before the war, but he died at the front in a plane crash. In the end, Hungary's location made it impossible to stay out of the war or to end fighting without serious consequences. Prime Minister Kálay had to resign, the country was occupied by German troops, and the gradual shift to the far right could not be stopped. The Regent was still in his place, but his power was weakened by the presence of the Gestapo, the Wehrmacht, and collaborationists. He had to navigate carefully, hoping that he could still counterbalance pressure from the radicals. Throughout 1944, more army units were sent to the front. Jewish citizens now had to face deportation, although in the case of Budapest, Horthy felt strong enough to stop the process. But then he himself was removed after a failed attempt to exit the war, and when his only surviving son was taken hostage by the Gestapo. Ferenc Szálasi became head of state, and what was left of Hungary turned into a totalitarian dictatorship, submerging into chaos as Budapest was under siege and Axis armies tried to hold on to the western half of the country. The period of real oppression had begun, with mass deportations and a total control over the media and all other spheres of life. Knowing what I know about this tragic period, I would say that Horthy himself was not a fascist dictator, but rather an old-fashioned conservative who tried, unsuccessfully, to stem the tide. He was a man of the late 19th century. He did not belong in the era of mass movements and radicalism. By the mid-1930s, due to the effects of the Great Depression, more and more people turned to new ideas that promised quick and easy solutions. Even the military, which was supposed to be under his control, was losing faith in him. In 1943, he had more than 100 loyal generals, but just 1 year later, only a handful of them were still following him. All the others put their faith in German military might. One could say that Horthy was closer to fascism than communism. That would certainly be true. However, he was disgusted by the gangster-like behavior of Hitler and doubted that Germany could win this new war. At the same time, he rejected meaningful cooperation with the Soviet leadership until the last moment, when it was simply too late. Stalin nonetheless appreciated his attempts and was not inclined to put Horthy on trial for war crimes or crimes against humanity. Instead, he was simply interviewed in Nuremberg as a witness, detailing his contacts with some of the defendants. The notion of a fascist dictatorship emerged after the war, as the communists exerted more and more control over the country. To push their own agenda, it was easier and probably more effective to simply label the Horthy era as a brutal fascist hell, just as they were implementing their own version of hell on earth. We should note that opinions differ even today. Society is still divided over this question, but we can say with confidence that interwar Hungary was neither a dictatorship nor a full-fledged parliamentary democracy. It was something in between, a form of limited parliamentarism, a political system that is not very far from our historical roots, the same roots that Hungary seems to return to every now and then.